Good morning to the witnesses, and I thank Ms Buckley and the CNAG in particular for their opening statements. The first thing I'd say, and I won't presume to speak for everybody here, but I think we all share the same wish. We want to have a planning system that works and makes fair and robust decisions in a timely manner. I think we would all share that goal. It clearly hasn't been the case over the last number of years, and that's set out in the documents before us. Ms Buckley, I welcome you to your new role. I don't envy you your task. You have a major rebuilding job ahead. I'm glad the new board members have been put in place, at least on that interim basis, and they'll be making decisions on files come May, I believe. You'll have a huge challenge as well in terms of recruiting necessary numbers of supporting staff, especially in light of new functions that are now assigned to the board. But I suspect the greatest challenge that's going to face you is around rebuilding public trust in a planning system which in many people's eyes is broken. You say it to yourself in the opening statement, events have had a serious detrimental impact on the board's reputation. I have to be honest, I don't think some of your own commentary at the IPI conference recently was helpful in that regard. I don't intend to dwell on that or address it here, but suffice it to say from my own point of view, I believe that robust decision-making in the first place is likely to reduce the instance of legal challenge. But in terms of remediating that public opinion of Board Pleanála, I wanted to ask you, first thing this morning, is whether the organisation should consider making a corporate public apology. Now, I wouldn't suggest a personal apology in any way, shape or form. You bear none of the responsibility of actions that were taken before you took up this role. But a corporate public apology, would that be appropriate for an organisation that has so damaged public trust in our planning system?
It is an extremely good question, Deputy, and actually one of the first things I did when I arrived in the board was to approve an apology to go on the board's website to people whose appeals and applications have been held up by the difficulties in Board Pleanála. And I'm very happy to repeat that apology to those persons who, absolutely through no fault of their own, have had their developments, their household developments held up because of the difficulties within Board Pleanála. I also, can I extend that apology to the staff of the board, because they've, through no fault of their own, have had to deal with an awful lot of very difficult discussions with members of the public about what was going on in Board Pleanála. And so that statement was also aimed at making sure that the staff had something they could say that was fair to them about that. And I, to be honest with you, I did consider making a corporate apology, as you say, because I wasn't there, not personal. And I'm happy to do so. The Board Pleanála, as an organisation, has already apologised to the people whose appeals have been caught up, and I'm happy to repeat that here today. It is most unfortunate. Can I also just raise the issue you mentioned about the IPI conferences? I'm very sorry that I became the story. That should not have been the case. And I'm very sorry I name-checked somebody who was not in the room to answer to those questions, so I shouldn't have done that. And that I have to learn a lesson from that, which is not to name-check people. And secondly, that in future, I have to understand that in this role, people are interested in everything I say, and I should write a script and I should stick to that script. Yeah. So that is my learning from that, and I'm very happy to say I won't be doing that in future.
I welcome those specific apologies, and I understand the case for those. I do think you should give consideration, and you've indicated that you're open to it, because it's not just individual planning applications. The entire public trust in our planning system has been undermined. So if you're open to considering that corporate public apology, I think that would be welcome. I want to stick with the issue of rebuilding trust, and a central component of that has to be transparency. You know, the old adage, the best disinfectant is sunlight. I note in your opening statement you've asked Lorna Lynch, SC, to carry out a scoping investigation and prepare a report. I note as well that you say, I've asked that the final report should be capable of being published, but there are caveats attached to that. Now, forgive me if that rings a little bit, there's a little bit of a father's head to that. Is there anything to be said for another mass? Because we've had reports. We've had numerous reports, and at least 2 of them have never seen the light of day. So the Minister of Housing commissioned the independent analysis around alleged conflict of interests. That's been forwarded to the DPP. I understand the rationale for that. There was another report from internal senior management, if I'm correct, and then there's this third report which is commissioned by Resolve Ireland, and apparently found ABP's Director of Planning had no case to answer. And I say apparently, in fact it's not apparent, it was never published. Now I'm assuming that that is a report that was paid for out of the public purse, you know, eventually as you follow the money back. It is the taxpayer who has footed the bill for that. So can I ask why that was never published? And can you not see how the burying of successive reports does nothing to rebuild public trust? I also want to ask, with regard to the report commissioned by the Minister, whether the board has had sight of that report, and if you've had sight of that report, whether you've implemented any of the recommendations in the interim.
So the first thing to say, to talk about the other reports, Deputy, generally speaking, when you're dealing with matters of HR, and in particular investigations that can lead to disciplinary or other outcomes, obviously, to be fair to the person who is involved in that case, you have to be extremely careful about how you conduct investigations and what you publish about those. At least one of the reports of which you're referring to was a HR investigation, and it would be most unusual to have that published. I don't know that I would be aware of that happening. Indeed, if an investigation happened into any conduct of mine, I wouldn't want the report, even if it...
That's the internal senior report you're referring to?
That's one of the internal reports that you're referring to into an individual in the organisation. The other report is a report that was conducted on a paper-based exercise by colleagues in Board Pleanála. I received legal advice to the effect that that should not be published, and the Board Pleanála, or indeed I, should not publish it. But it very clearly, given the areas of concern that was covered, I should say that report was always intended at the first stage in a process. So what I've done is I've started the second stage of the process, which is to conduct an external investigation comprising the same role, but which will involve interviews with people. So people will be allowed, if there are issues that are raised from the papers, those issues will be put to the individual in question, and they will be allowed an opportunity to respond. On foot of that, I expect to get recommendations from Ms Lynch as to possible next steps that might be taken. There may be none. There may be just recommendations about how to improve the processes on Board Pleanála. If that is what is the outcome, I'll be able to publish that report straight away. However, if on foot of her investigation, Ms Lynch recommends that further steps are taken, either disciplinary steps, referral to the Minister in the case of a serving board member, for example, or indeed referral to another external authority, I'll have to do that. And obviously, in those circumstances, what you could do is cause problems for the subsequent investigation, the subsequent process, if you were to publish the report at that stage. I don't have any problem publishing any report as long as I can, and my legal advice is that I can publish, and I will do so. The ministerial report that you're talking about, there was a ministerial action plan that has been published. Are you talking about the Remy Farrell investigation? Well, that's not my document. As it happens, it was...
Have you had sight of it or not?
I personally have had sight of it, yes. It was given to me so I would understand the circumstances I was going into.
Yeah, so has the board, if you personally have a sight of it?
I have personally read it, but on Board Pleanála has not seen it. No other person on Board Pleanála has seen it.
Okay, so in that instance you haven't. If there are recommendations considered within that report, it's fair to say that the board hasn't had sight of the report, so can't have implemented recommendations contained therein.
That's correct, yes.
Okay, you can see how the public might cast a jaundiced eye on yet another report when I think this is the fourth commissioned, presumably all paid for out of the public purse, and yet even Oireachtas members who sit on PAC who haven't had sight of these reports. In
circumstances where I had legal advice that I couldn't publish the internal report, I was absolutely concerned that should not be the case, and that I wouldn't have the point made of, well, you had a report and you did nothing with it.
Okay.
So I have gone and taken this next step, and I think that's a really important next step.
I have an eye to the clock, Ms Buckley, and many questions that I want to get to. Just from the Office of the Planning Regulator report, Phase 1, it talks about more recently Board Pleanála has faced high level of successful legal challenges to its decisions and associated costs, approximately 8 million or 45% of its budget in 2021. It's a very substantial proportion of anybody's budget to be going out on legal fees. I look at the figures from 2022, where on board Pleanála won 9 cases, lost 9 cases, and then conceded 35 of them. In that kind of context, I find it difficult to credit, if I'm honest, that a head of legal services has only been put in place now. And so, I mean, we can talk about costs being awarded to third parties, but the fact is the state has outsourced much of its own costs in terms of taking legal advice on board. In relation to the 7.6 million spent on legal costs, can you just give us a breakdown in terms of, my assumption is most of them refer to SHDs, but correct me if I'm wrong on that. How many of them refer to normal planning application, SIDs, LRDs, etc.? Can you give me any insight into the breakdown there?
I can, Deputy, and can I say I would share your view. I think the litigation environment the board is operating in now is fundamentally different to that of many of years ago, but the board itself did not adapt to this new external legal environment and is only adapting now. But as you know, I put in place the recruitment of a head of legal, and we will be recruiting more internal legal resources. I find it very strange. That being said, and I suppose one of the points I was trying to make last week is that actually the SHD has driven only part of that very substantial layer of losing and conceding cases. The conceding cases obviously is the really big issue there, because why are you taking decisions you can't stand over them when they're challenged? So in fact, say last year, just to take that as an example, we conceded 35 cases, but 16 of them were on normal planning appeals. 3 of them were SIDS, infrastructure. 5 were others, that would be CPOs and what have you, and only 11, so only a third of them were SHDs. Okay. So and very much the point I was trying to make last week is that SHD, there is a kind of a belief in planning circles in particular that once SHD decisions have gone through the system, this will all be all right, and judicial reviews will fall back to 1 a week as opposed to 2 a week or 3 a week or whatever. I don't believe that to be the case. So the board has to adapt. It has to bring in additional legal resources internally. And I have to say, in my discussions with our external legal firms who ably represent us, they're very relieved the board is moving to strengthen its internal core around being able to take robust decisions.
Thanks, Ms. Buckley. I just have and I'm sorry to cut you short, and I know other members will dig down into these costs. There is another aspect I just want to briefly explore. And I mean, you've referred to it yourself, that the context for making these decisions is changing all the time. I wanted to refer to some of the environmental context. So traditionally, the Irish planning system, and therefore the board, enjoyed quite a wide discretion when being asked to judge against quite flexible standards. That could be seen as quite subjective. Now, subsequent EU legislation in particular, and also now Irish legislation, has introduced much more objective tests. For example, the obligations under the Habitats and Birds Directive, under the Water Framework Directive, and more recently, of course, obligations under the Climate Action and Low Carbon Development Act. These all have strong and clear tests, which are aimed respectively at biodiversity loss, water quality, and around emissions. The board has repeatedly found itself losing cases under the Birds and Habitat Directive, which is the oldest of these legal regimes. We've seen a high-profile decision just recently made with respect to the Galway Ring Road that would refer to the new Climate Act. This is only going one way. I note in your opening statement you've acknowledged those extra responsibilities the board will have to shoulder under the likes of the Maritime Area Planning Act in particular. How do we propose to address this? I'm assuming you're going to say we need massive extra resource. Do you have the plans in place to recruit not just the bodies, but the expertise in terms of the resource we need?
So you're quite correct, Deputy. I mean, the level of complexity in the planning environmental system is of an order that, I mean, I used to be involved in this area 15, 16 years ago, which is probably why I was invited back to do this role temporarily. And the level of complexity involved is streets ahead of where it was even 15 years ago. To a degree, we need resources, yes, and we need expertise. And I have a substantial sanctioned rate of pulling people in, but I'll probably be going back to the department in due course saying, in fact, we need extra ecologists, we need extra, we need those skills. We do a lot of recruitment of external expertise because quite often, just to say to you, so say in the marine side of things, those skill sets aren't available in Ireland, or where they are available, they've already been used and they're involved in by the private sector in preparing their applications, so we can't use them, there are conflicts. Or other public bodies are desperately trying to recruit them, and that's some of the issues. So we tend to have to pull in expertise from across Europe, actually, is what we're looking at there. It's going to be a challenge to keep ahead of all those, particularly under the current government, given its focus on these matters. But I think the focus that I have, and one of the cultural shifts we need to make as we move into being on Comisiún Pleanála, will be a focus on a learning environment and a constantly evolving learning body, so that the people that we bring in keep pace with those developments and keep pace and keep learning, and that is going to have to be a big investment in the new staff that we have, and indeed in the board members, because the board members need to be kept up to speed with these developments as well.
Thank you.